A Barren Duchess is a broken contract." The words, spoken by her husband, the Duke of Blackwood, did not thunder through the ballroom. They did not need to. They were dropped into the sudden, suffocating silence like a stone into a well, the ripples spreading outwards in waves of shock, pity, and cruel, satisfied whispers. Elara stood beside him, a statue carved from ice and humiliation, the heat of 100 bodies, the cloying scent of beeswax and wilted lilies, the oppressive weight of jewels on her skin. It all vanished. There was only the cold, a deep, internal winter that froze the breath in her lungs and the blood in her veins. She felt the collective gaze of the ton, 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her composure. They saw her not as a woman, but as a failed vessel, a faulty piece of aristocratic machinery. Alistair did not look at her. His jaw was a hard line of granite, his gaze fixed on some point over the heads of their guests, as if addressing a parliament of ghosts. He was performing a duty, excising a flaw from his lineage, and she was the flaw. Beside him, his mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, wore an expression of carefully constructed sorrow. It was a masterpiece of social theater. A slight downturn of her lips, a glistening in her eyes that spoke of maternal disappointment, not of the vicious, triumphant scheming that had led to this moment. She had won. After 2 years of insinuation, of pointed remarks about empty nurseries and the sacred duty of the Blackwood line, she had finally engineered this public execution. Alara's own hands, gloved in white kidskin, were clenched so tightly at her sides that she felt the seams strain. She could feel the phantom weight of the physician's cold instruments from the examination earlier that day, an indignity orchestrated by Beatrice and rubber-stamped by a doctor whose loyalty was clearly for sale. He had pronounced his verdict with a sad shake of his head, a verdict Alistair had accepted without question, without a single glance at his wife's ashen face. He had accepted it because he wanted to, because the pressure for an heir had become a poison in their marriage, turning what little warmth had once existed into a brittle, resentful silence. He saw her emptiness as a personal affront, a failure to uphold her end of the bargain, and now he had made it official. He had declared the contract void. She did not scream. She did not weep or faint as some of the other ladies might have done for show. A strange, terrifying clarity settled over her. She saw every face in the crowd with pinpoint precision. Lady Danbury's thinly veiled smirk, Lord Ashworth's pitying glance, which was somehow worse, the hungry, speculative looks of the unmarried daughters, their mothers already calculating the value of a newly available duke. She was no longer the Duchess of Blackwood. In that moment, she was simply a public disgrace, a cautionary tale to be whispered over tea for the remainder of the season. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head to look at her husband. For the first time all evening, he was forced to meet her gaze. She made sure he saw the utter desolation in her eyes. She wanted him to see the woman he had just broken. She wanted the image to be seared into his memory, to haunt him in the silent, empty halls of this grand house he prized more than her heart. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. She did not run. Her back was straight, her head held high, a parody of the poise that had been drilled into her since birth. Each step was an agony. The rustle of her silk gown sounded like a fire consuming her. She walked through the parted sea of guests, their whispers lapping at her like a foul tide, and did not stop until she reached the grand staircase. She ascended into the shadows, leaving the light, the music, and the life she had known behind her. The contract was broken, and so was she. Upstairs, in the opulent suite of rooms that had never felt like hers, the silence was a physical blow. The air, thick with the scent of her rosewater perfume, now seemed to mock her. This was the gilded cage she had inhabited, a beautiful prison where her only function had been to breed. Having failed, she was being discarded. Her lady's maid, Clara, rushed in, her face pale with horror. "Your Grace, I cannot believe—" Ilara held up a hand, a gesture that was surprisingly steady. "Please, Clara, do not." The title felt like acid on her tongue. "Just help me out of this dress." The gown, a confection of silver silk and intricate beadwork, felt like a suit of armor she was desperate to shed. As Clara's trembling fingers worked the dozens of tiny buttons, Ilara stared at her reflection in the vast, gilt-framed mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her eyes were hollowed-out pits in a face of white marble. The famous Blackwood diamonds encircling her throat felt like a hangman's noose. Once the dress was off, she stood in her chemise, shivering not from the cold, but from the shock that was beginning to thaw into a searing, agonizing pain. She walked to the jewelry box on her vanity. It was a treasure trove, filled with the glittering shackles of her marriage. Necklaces, tiaras, earrings, all property of the duchy, just as she had been. She unclasped the diamonds and let them fall onto the velvet lining, their clatter unnervingly loud in the quiet room. She removed every ring, every bracelet. She was stripping herself of an identity that no longer belonged to her. "Pack a small bag for me, Clara," she said, her voice low and even. "Something simple, a traveling dress, the plainest one I own, and my warmest cloak." "A bag? Your Grace, where are you going?" "Away." The word was a breath, a prayer. She went to the hidden safe behind a tapestry. Inside was not jewelry, but a modest sum of cash she had saved over the years from her personal allowance, a secret nest egg for a rainy day she had never truly believed would come. The rain was here. It was a deluge. She took it all, stuffing the notes into a simple leather reticule. She was leaving everything else: the clothes, the status, the name. They were part of the contract. She would take only herself, dressed in a dark wool gown, the kind a respectable merchant's wife might wear. She felt lighter, more real. The weight of expectation had been lifted, replaced by the terrifying lightness of an unknown future. "Do not tell anyone I have gone until morning," she instructed Clara, pressing a small, heavy purse into the maid's hand. "This is for your loyalty. Find a new position. Forget you ever knew me." Clara was weeping now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "But, my lady—" Ilara used her old title for the last time. It was a kindness. "I am no longer your lady, Clara. I am no one." She did not use the grand staircase. She took the servants' stairs, a winding, narrow passage she had never used before. It smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage, the sense of honest work. It felt like a path to a different world. She slipped out a side door into the gardens, the chill night air a shocking, welcome slap to her senses. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky. The music from the ballroom was a faint, muffled pulse, the heartbeat of a life that had already rejected her. She looked back at the sprawling stone facade of Blackwood Manor, its windows blazing with light like 100 accusing eyes. It was not a home. It had been a tomb for her hopes. She walked down the long, gravel drive, her simple shoes crunching on the stones. With every step, the Duchess of Blackwood died a little more, and with every step, a woman named Ilara, stripped of everything but her own quiet determination, began to walk toward an uncertain dawn. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. She carried nothing but a small bag, a little money, and the deep, aching certainty that her life, as she had known it, was over. Weeks later, in a cramped, damp room above a bakery in a town whose name she had barely registered, the nausea began. At first, she dismissed it as a symptom of her grief, of the poor food and the constant, gnawing anxiety. But it persisted, a relentless churning in the pit of her stomach every morning. A terrifying, impossible suspicion began to take root in the barren ground of her despair. Her hands trembled as she counted the weeks on her fingers. It couldn't be. The doctors, the specialists, her husband, his mother, They had all declared her empty, a failure, barren. Yet, the sickness continued. A strange weariness settled deep in her bones. With the last of her dwindling funds, she sought out an old midwife on the edge of town, a woman with eyes as clear and sharp as winter frost, and hands gnarled from catching new life. The midwife, whose name was Agnes, asked few questions. She examined Alara with a gentle, practiced touch, her expression unreadable. After a long silence, Agnes sat back. "Well, my dear," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "For a woman who's been told she's barren, you're in a rather peculiar state." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What state?" "The state of being well and truly with child." The room tilted. Alara gripped the edge of the rough wooden table to steady herself. Are you certain?" Agnes chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "As certain as I am that the sun will rise. Been doing this for 50 years. I know life when I feel it." She paused, her gaze sharpening. "And if I'm not mistaken, I feel two." Twins. The word echoed in the cavernous space where her heart used to be. Not one child, but two. The irony was so cruel, so viciously absolute, that a strangled laugh escaped her lips, quickly turning into a sob. She, Alara, the barren Duchess, was carrying the Blackwood heirs, the heirs her husband had publicly disowned her to obtain. The lie was staggering in its audacity. The conspiracy orchestrated by Beatrice and her paid physician was not just a social maneuver. It was a theft of her future, of her children's birthright. They had not just cast her out. They had tried to erase her very purpose. The tears that came were not of self-pity. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. A fire ignited in the frozen landscape of her soul, burning away the shock and the grief, leaving behind a hard, resolute core of fury. They would not have her children. These babies, this impossible miracle growing within her, were hers alone. They were not Blackwood heirs. They were not pawns in a dynastic game. They were the reason for her survival. Her purpose was no longer to be a duchess, but to be a mother, and she would protect them with the ferocity of a she-wolf, from the world, from poverty, and most of all, from the man who had so easily believed her worthless. She left that town the next day, pushing further north, seeking anonymity in the harsh, windswept landscape of the coast. She found it in Saltwind, a small, gritty fishing village that clung to the cliffs like a stubborn barnacle. The air smelled of salt, fish, and wood smoke. The people were hardened by the sea, their faces weathered, their hands calloused. They were not interested in pasts or titles. They cared only for resilience and hard work. Here she became Mrs. Eames, a widow whose husband had been lost at sea. The lie was simple and sadly common in this village, and it was accepted without question. She rented a tiny, derelict cottage at the edge of the village, its stone walls constantly damp with sea mist, its windows rattling in the perpetual wind. She used the last of her money to buy thread, needles, and a few yards of plain cloth. Her fine needlework, once a genteel hobby to pass the time in suffocating drawing rooms, now became her means of survival. She mended fishing nets for the gruff, silent fishermen. She sewed simple shirts and patched worn trousers for their wives. Her fingers, once soft and pale, became chapped and pricked, but they were her own. Her closest neighbor was a woman named Martha, the widow of the former harbor master. She was broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, with a brusque kindness that Alara found more comforting than any society sympathy. Martha saw a young woman in trouble and, without asking for details, simply helped. She brought Alara hot soup when the morning sickness was at its worst. She showed her how to bank the fire to make the coal last longer. She taught her which herbs to gather from the cliffs to make a tea that eased her aching back. As her belly grew, so did her strength. The physical hardship scoured away the last vestiges of the fragile lady she had been. She learned to haul water from the village well, to scrub her own floors, to bake a passable loaf of bread over an open fire. Her body, once a disappointment, was now a source of wonder. It was strong, capable, and it was creating life. Section 5. Years passed. 5 years of relentless wind, of the ceaseless roar of the sea, of the smell of salt baked into her skin and clothes. 5 years of aching loneliness and fierce, consuming love. The cottage was no longer derelict. It was a home. A small patch of garden in the back produced enough vegetables to see them through the winter. The windows were repaired. The hearth swept clean. It was small, humble, and it was hers. Julian and Liana were 4 years old, wild and beautiful as the coastline they called home. Liana had her mother's dark, wavy hair and determined chin, but her eyes were a soft, gentle brown. Julian was his father in miniature, the same thick, sandy blonde hair, the same serious brow, and the same startling, unmistakable eyes, the color of a stormy sky, a shade of gray so unique it was known as the Blackwood mark. Every time Alara looked into her son's eyes, it was a stab of memory, a reminder of the man who had cast her aside. But the pain was dulled now, covered over by the thick scar tissue of her love for her children. They were everything, her son, her moon, her entire world. They knew nothing of dukes or titles. Their world was made of rock pools, seashell collections, and the stories their mother spun for them by the firelight. They were poor, but they were happy, and they were safe. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, the Duke of Blackwood existed in a state of gilded misery. Alistair had done his duty. He had his engagement to Lady Annalise, a pretty, pliable girl of 18 with impeccable bloodlines, and, according to her mother, the hips of a broodmare. The wedding was set. The contracts were signed. The succession was, in theory, secured. But his victory was hollow. The great halls of Blackwood Manor echoed with a silence that Alara's quiet presence had somehow held at bay. His new fiancée filled the rooms with mindless chatter and shrill laughter, but it only served to emphasize the emptiness. He found himself walking the corridors at night, drawn to the suite of rooms that had been hers, standing in the doorway and breathing in the faint, lingering scent of roses he could never quite erase. His mother was triumphant. She presided over the household with renewed vigor, planning the wedding with militaristic precision, her satisfaction a cloying perfume in the air. But Alistair found he could barely stand to be in the same room with her. A seed of doubt, planted in the moment he saw the look in Alara's eyes as she walked away, had taken root and was growing into a thorny, choking weed of suspicion. He remembered Alara's quiet strength, her intelligence, the wry humor that had occasionally broken through her reserve. He compared it to Annalise's vapid sweetness and found the comparison sickening. He had traded gold for guilt. The catalyst for his investigation was a small, seemingly insignificant thing. A drunken solicitor, a friend of the physician his mother had hired, made a careless remark at a gentleman's club. "Old Dr. Hemlock," he'd slurred, laughing, "can diagnose a barren womb from across the street, so long as the purse is heavy enough." The comment snagged in Alistair's mind. It replayed over and over, aligning with the unease that had plagued him for years. The next day, he hired a man, not a common investigator, but Mr. Thorne, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient gentleman who specialized in the quiet, delicate secrets of the aristocracy. His instructions were simple. Find out everything there was to know about Dr. Hemlock's finances and his correspondence with the Dowager Duchess. Thorne's investigation was slow and meticulous. It took months, but eventually the pieces began to fall into place. Bank ledgers showing a large, unexplained deposit into the doctor's account the day after Alara's public humiliation, a dismissed secretary who recalled hushed meetings and burned letters, a trail of lies and deceit that led directly, unequivocally, to his own mother. The truth, when it was finally laid bare in a stark report on his desk, was more depraved than he could have imagined. His mother had not merely suspected Alara's infertility, she had invented it. She had paid a doctor to falsify a medical diagnosis to rid herself of a daughter-in-law she deemed unsuitable, too quiet and not easily controlled. Alistair felt a cold, murderous rage, followed by a wave of self-loathing so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. He hadn't just been a fool, he had been a willing accomplice. He had been so consumed by his own pride and the pressure of his title that he had never once questioned the verdict. He had not defended his wife. He had not stood by her. He had been her executioner. He had destroyed the one person who had ever looked at him as a man, not a duke. And for what? For a lie. The final piece of Thorne's report was the most devastating. He had also been tasked with finding Alara. For 5 years the trail was cold, but a whisper, a rumor of a lady with fine hands working as a seamstress, had finally led him to the remote village of Saltwind. She goes by the name of Eames, the report concluded. A widow. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl, about 4 years of age. Alistair stared at the words, his blood running cold. 4 years of age. The timeline was a brutal, perfect match. The possibility, the hope and the horror of it, was a physical shock. He canceled his wedding that same day, sending a curt note to Lady Annalise's father that caused a scandal that would rock the ton for months. He didn't care. He faced his mother in the library, the investigator's report lying between them like a loaded pistol. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice lethally quiet. Beatrice tried to bluster, to deny, but the evidence was irrefutable. Her composure finally cracked, revealing the ugly, grasping ambition beneath. "I did it for you. For this family. She was barren. She was of no use." "She is my wife," he gritted out, the words tasting like ash. "And you will leave this house by sunset. You will retire to the dowager house in the farthest corner of Scotland. You will have a generous allowance, but you will have no contact with society, and you will never, ever contact me or my family again. If you do, I will cut you off without a shilling and let the world know exactly what you did." Her ruin was absolute. He felt no satisfaction in it, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had cleaned the wound, but the poison remained. The next morning he set out for Saltwind. He traveled not in his ducal carriage, but in a plain, unmarked coach, a single valet, his only companion. He didn't know what he would find. He didn't know what he would say. He only knew he had to go. He had to see her. He had to know the truth of the children. And he had to begin the impossible task of atoning for a sin so great, he was not sure it could ever be forgiven. The village of Saltwind was even more remote and weather-beaten than he had imagined. The air was sharp with the sting of salt, and the wind carried the cries of gulls. The locals stared at his fine clothes with open, unabashed suspicion. He found the inn, a grimy, low-ceilinged establishment that smelled of stale ale and fish, and took a room. He asked the innkeeper where he might find a Mrs. Eames. The man grunted, pointing a thumb towards the edge of the village. "The widow? In the last cottage before the cliffs. Keeps to herself." Alistair walked, his polished boots ill-suited to the muddy, cobbled track. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic, panicked drum. And then he saw it. A tiny stone cottage, a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney, nestled against the vast, gray expanse of the sea. And in the small patch of garden in front, 2 children were playing. A little girl with a riot of dark curls was chasing a butterfly, and a small boy, intent on digging in the dirt with a stick, looked up as Alistair approached. The world stopped. The boy's eyes, looking up at him with frank, childish curiosity, were his own, that same specific stormy shade of gray. There was no doubt, no possibility of a mistake. This was his son. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees. Joy, grief, regret, a love so fierce it was painful. washed over him. He had a son. He had a daughter. He had a family he had thrown away. Just then, the cottage door opened. Alara emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. She was no longer the Duchess of Blackwood. The fine silks were gone, replaced by a simple, faded dress of homespun wool. Her hair was not artfully styled, but tied back in a practical knot, loose tendrils whipping in the wind. Her face was leaner, weathered by the sun and sea, but it was more beautiful than he had ever remembered. There was a strength in her, a self-possession he had never seen before. She saw him and froze. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the sea. Her expression was not one of shock or fear, but of a cold, weary resignation, as if she had always known this day would come. "Liana, Julian," she said, her voice calm but carrying a new, rougher timbre. "Come inside, now." The children, sensing the tension, immediately obeyed, running past him into the cottage without a backward glance. Alara did not move. She stood on her doorstep, a barrier between him and the life she had built. "What are you doing here?" she asked. There was no title, no deference, just a flat, tired question. Alistair's carefully rehearsed speeches, the apologies he had practiced for days, dissolved on his tongue. He was left with the raw, ugly truth. "Alara, He took a step forward. "Don't," she warned, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Do not come any closer." He stopped. The few yards between them felt like a chasm. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know everything, about my mother, the doctor, the lie." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lip. "You know? How wonderful for you. Did your conscience finally become inconvenient?" "It was more than that. I investigated. I found proof." "Proof?" she scoffed. "I have all the proof I need. I have 5 years of proof. 5 years of scrubbing floors and mending nets to feed your children. 5 years of terror that they would fall ill, and I wouldn't have the coin for a doctor. Where was your proof then?" The shame was a physical thing, a hot poker in his gut. "I was a fool, Alara, blinded by pride and duty. I let my mother manipulate me. I believed. I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" She laughed, and the sound was chilling. "Your Grace is sorry? Well, that solves everything, doesn't it? You can return to your comfortable life now, your duty done." The formal title was a slap in the face, a deliberate cruelty designed to remind him of the gulf between them. "They are my children," he whispered, his gaze flickering toward the closed cottage door. "The boy, he has my eyes." "He has your eyes," she agreed, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low pitch. "And he has my strength. He will not be a pawn for the Blackwood title. Neither of them will. They are mine. You gave up any claim to them, to me, on the floor of that ballroom. I can give them everything," he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "A name, a future, security." "They have a name," she shot back. "It's Eames, and they have a future. One where they are loved for who they are, not for the title they can carry. As for security, we have survived. We have done it without you. We don't need you." Her words were stones, each one striking a fresh wound. She was right. He had nothing to offer her that she truly needed. He had power, wealth, status, all the things she had learned to live without. The one thing she might have wanted, his trust, his faith, his love, he had publicly and spectacularly destroyed. "I am not leaving," he said, the decision solidifying in his soul. "I am not here to take them. I am here to earn the right to know them." "There is no earning this," she said, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "You don't get to reappear after 5 years and purchase a family with a well-worded apology. Now, please leave. You are upsetting my children." She turned and went inside, closing the door firmly behind her. The click of the latch was as final as a coffin lid shutting. Alistair stood alone on the muddy track, the sea wind whipping at his coat. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He commanded fortunes, armies, the respect of a nation, and he had just been dismissed like a common beggar by a seamstress in a ruined cottage. He had never felt so powerless, or so determined. He did not leave. He walked back to the inn, his mind a maelstrom of shame and a nascent, stubborn resolve. He sent his valet and the coach back to London with a letter for his solicitor. The first part contained instructions to formally and publicly break his engagement to Lady Annalise, citing insurmountable personal reasons. The scandal would be immense, but it was a necessary public declaration. He was choosing Alara, even if she would not have him. The second part of the letter was more practical. It arranged for a significant, untraceable sum of money to be deposited in an account for a Mrs. Martha, the harbormaster's widow, Alara's neighbor. He would not insult Alara by offering her money directly, but he could ensure her friend had the resources to help her should the need arise. Then he dismissed his valet. "Go home, Thomas. I will be staying for a while." The valet stared, aghast. "Alone, Your Grace? In this place?" "Alone," Alistair confirmed. He kept one sturdy trunk of his plainest clothes and sent the rest back. His presence in Saltwind became an immediate and baffling spectacle. The Duke, living in the best room at the Salty Dog, which meant it had a window that closed and a mattress mostly free of lumps, became the subject of endless gossip. He had no servants, no carriage. He took his meals in the common room, eating the same fish stew as the sailors and fishermen, enduring their suspicious stares in silence. He did not approach Alara's cottage again. He understood that she needed space, that any attempt to force a reconciliation would only drive her further away. Instead, he watched. From a distance, he saw her every morning, walking with her children along the beach, their small figures silhouetted against the gray waves. He saw the way she laughed with them, a free, beautiful sound he had never heard from her in London. He saw the fierce, protective love in her eyes. He saw the life she had built, a life of hardship and joy that had no place for him, and it broke his heart. He began to make himself useful, in small, unobtrusive ways. He saw that the gate to her small garden was hanging from a single hinge, battered by the wind. He waited until she and the children were away at the market. Then, using tools borrowed from the innkeeper, he repaired it. He reset the posts, fixed the hinge, and reinforced the latch. He was clumsy, his hands soft and unused to labor, but he worked until the job was done. Another day, he saw her struggling to carry a heavy basket of laundry from the village well. The next morning, before dawn, he hauled 2 heavy buckets of water and left them on her doorstep, vanishing before the village was awake. He commissioned work from her, through Martha. He asked the widow to have Mrs. Eames make him several new shirts, paying 3 times the going rate. He knew Alara would be too proud to accept charity, but she would not refuse honest work. When the shirts arrived, delivered by Martha, they were impeccably stitched. He ran his fingers over the seams, imagining her hands, hands that should have been adorned with jewels, performing this humble labor. Martha watched him with shrewd, knowing eyes. One evening, as he sat alone in the inn, she approached his table. "You're the husband," she stated. It wasn't a question. Alistair looked up, startled. "Yes." "The one who broke her heart?" He flinched. "Yes." Martha sat down, her expression stern. "She's a good woman, a strong woman, stronger than any I've ever known. She came here with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fire in her belly. She's built a life for those children, a good life." "I know," Alistair said quietly. "I am not here to destroy it." "Then what are you here for?" He looked at his hands, calloused now from fixing the gate. "To atone," he said simply, "however long it takes." Martha studied him for a long moment. Fixing a gate is one thing, Mending a soul is another. She stood up. The boy, Julian, he asks about you. He calls you the sad man. The words were a knife in his chest. His own son saw him as nothing more than a figure of pity. A week later, Mr. Thorne arrived from London. He brought with him a portfolio of documents. He had secured a signed, sworn confession from Dr. Hemlock, who, facing complete ruin, had detailed the entire conspiracy. He also brought copies of the Dowager Duchess's bank ledgers and letters from her exile in Scotland, filled with bitter recriminations that only further proved her guilt. Alistair took the portfolio. He did not send for Alara. He walked to her cottage in the late afternoon, when he knew the children would be napping. He knocked softly on the door. She opened it, her face a mask of weary impatience. "What do you want?" "5 minutes of your time," he said. "Not to talk, just to show you something. Then I will leave you in peace." She hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside, letting him into the single, small room that served as kitchen, parlor, and workroom. It was sparse but spotlessly clean, warmed by a small fire. Children's drawings were tacked to the wall. It felt more like a home than his entire ducal palace. He did not speak. He simply opened the portfolio on her small wooden table and laid out the documents one by one. The doctor's confession, the bank statements, his mother's letters, the public announcement of his broken engagement. He laid the truth at her feet, without excuse or embellishment. Alara read them in silence. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She traced the lines of the doctor's signature with a trembling finger. She read her mother-in-law's venomous words. She saw the notice from the London papers. The evidence was overwhelming, a testament to a betrayal so profound it was almost beyond comprehension. When she was done, she looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But they were not tears of forgiveness. They were tears of an old, deep pain, brought fresh to the surface. "So it was all a lie," she whispered. "All of it," he confirmed. "You stood there and let her do it. You said those words." "Yes," he said, his own voice thick with shame. "And I will live with that for the rest of my life. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Alara. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know the truth. You were never broken. You were never barren. You were wronged, and I was the fool who held the knife." He turned and left the portfolio on the table, walking out of the cottage and back into the wind. He had given her the truth. Now the choice was hers. He expected she would tell him to leave for good, and he knew he would have to obey. He had done all he could. He didn't see her for 3 days. He kept to the inn, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He was preparing to leave, to return to his empty life, when a small figure appeared at the door of the inn's common room. It was Julian. The boy stood there, clutching a wooden boat, looking at him with those impossibly familiar gray eyes. "Mama said I could ask you," Julian said, his small voice piping up in the sudden silence of the room. "Are you the sad man?" Alistair's throat closed. He knelt so he was on the boy's level. "Sometimes," he managed to say. "My name is Alistair." "Mine's Julian," the boy offered. He held out the boat. "The mast is broken. Mama said you're good at fixing things." It was a test, an offering, a tiny, fragile bridge being extended across the chasm. "I can try," Alistair said, his voice unsteady. He took the small toy boat, his large hands clumsy around it. He spent the next hour with his son at a table in the corner, carefully whittling a new mast from a piece of scrap wood and rigging it with a bit of twine. Liana came to watch, shyly at first, then with growing curiosity. He spoke to them gently, asking them about their shells and their games, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. When the boat was fixed, Alara appeared at the doorway. She was not smiling, but the hard, defensive shell around her had softened. There was a cautious, questioning look in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "It was my pleasure," he replied, his gaze holding hers. That evening, she sent word via Martha. She would walk with him on the beach, after the children were asleep. They met on the sand, the moon casting a pale, silvery light on the churning waves. For a long time, they walked in silence, the only sound the roar of the sea and the crunch of their feet on the shingle. "Why did you stay?" she finally asked. "Because leaving would have been easier," he answered honestly. "Because for the first time in my life, I am trying to do the hard thing, not the easy one. Because my life without you and them is nothing. It's a title and a pile of stones. It has no meaning." "I have changed, Alistair," she said, using his name for the first time. "I am not the woman you married. I am not quiet or docile. I will not be managed." "I don't want the woman I married," he said, stopping to face her. "She was lovely, but she was a stranger to me, and I was a fool for not seeing her. I want the woman standing in front of me now, the one who survived, the one who built a life from nothing, the one who is strong enough to stand against the sea and not be broken by it." He reached out, not to touch her, but holding his hand open in the space between them. "I am not asking you to come back to my world. I am asking if you will let me be a part of yours, on your terms, whatever they are." She looked at his hand, then up at his face, searching his eyes in the moonlight. She saw the shame, the regret, but she also saw a sincerity that had never been there before, a humility. He was not a duke demanding his rights. He was a man begging for a chance. Slowly, tentatively, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, a slow, cautious, difficult beginning. They did not return to London immediately. Alistair stayed in Saltwind for another month, living at the inn. He spent his days with the children, earning their trust, not with gifts, but with time. He taught Julian how to skip stones. He helped Lyanna build the most magnificent sandcastle the beach had ever seen. He listened to their stories. He let them see him as a man, not a myth. He courted Alara again, not with jewels or grand gestures, but with quiet conversations on the beach, with shared cups of tea in her small cottage after the children slept. He learned about the hardships she had faced, and his respect for her grew into a profound awe. He told her of his empty, gilded life, confessing his own weaknesses and vanities with a raw honesty he had never shown another soul. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. She held all the cards. She was the one who was whole, who knew her own worth. He was the one who was broken, seeking to be remade. When they finally decided to return, it was as partners. They left Saltwind not as a duke and his reclaimed Duchess, but as a family. Alistair endowed the village with a fund to build a new school and a sturdier dock, a silent thank you to the place that had sheltered his family. Arriving at Blackwood Manor was a strange experience. The opulent halls that had once intimidated Alara now seemed merely large and in need of airing out. She was no longer a guest in her husband's home. She was its mistress, and she would shape it to her will. The staff, who had whispered about the Barren Duchess, now saw a confident, strong woman with the Duke's children at her side. Alistair made it clear, in a formal address to the entire household, that Alara was to be obeyed in all things, that her word was his. He publicly christened the twins as Julian Alistair and Lyanna Rose, the rightful heirs of Blackwood. He made sure the announcement was printed in every London paper, a final, definitive rebuke to the scandal his mother had created. Their new life was not a fairy tale. There were moments of doubt, echoes of old hurts that sometimes surfaced in the quiet of the night, but they faced them together. He learned to listen, truly listen to her thoughts and opinions. She learned to trust again, to accept the love and devotion he offered daily in 100 small, consistent ways. Their happiness was not found in the grand ballrooms or at glittering royal functions. They found it in the quiet moments, reading stories to the children by the fire in the nursery, a room that was no longer empty. walking hand in hand through the gardens, their conversation easy and filled with a gentle humor. They transformed the cold, imposing manor into a warm, vibrant home. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Alistair found Alara in the walled garden, sitting on a stone bench, watching Julian and Liana, now boisterous 10-year-olds, chase each other through the fallen leaves. The setting sun cast a golden glow on her face, and she looked utterly at peace. He sat beside her, taking her hand. It was no longer the soft, pale hand of a duchess, nor the chapped, hard-working hand of a seamstress. It was simply her hand, strong and warm in his. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The sea?" She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that still had the power to take his breath away. "Sometimes I miss the sound of it," she admitted. "But I have everything I ever needed right here." She squeezed his hand. "We built a better life, Alistair." "You built it," he corrected her gently. "You built it from the ruins I left behind. I just finally found my way home." He looked at his family, his strong, incredible wife, his laughing, vibrant children, and a wave of gratitude so profound it was almost painful washed over him. The contract he had once thought broken had been rewritten, not on paper, but on the heart, and its terms were no longer duty and title, but forgiveness, respect, and a hard-won, extraordinary love.